glad to welcome everybody who has joined us here on our Zoom meeting, and also who are watching us on YouTube. My name is Maksim Bulanov. I'm working in Moscow City Pedagogical University, and tonight we are holding a very wonderful conversation with our colleagues from United States of America. I will introduce everybody in a couple of moments. So the main theme for tonight and tomorrow's session with Ekaterina Sonova, Anastasia Rosinskaya, and others is a very, very new theme for Russian education, like in some kind of new concept, educational urban studies. We used to talk about education, we used to talk about cities, and today we are experiencing the mixture of these two big themes. And here in Moscow City Pedagogical University, we are launching several researches about the city, about educational practices in the city, about educational businesses, and questions of leadership, equity in education. And I'm very excited about our conversation tonight, because our colleagues from IUPUI, they are very experienced in this kind of researches, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys. So the key question for tonight, I was playing with the words, and finally I came to this kind of conclusion. When we read articles from around the globe, from around the world, I can see several terminology, like urban education, educational urbanism, educational urban studies. And in different countries, different scientists understand sometimes different things under these terms. So tonight, the big question I would like to answer is it a terminological confusion, or is it a resource for joint research? And tonight we are talking with our dearest colleagues from School of Education, Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, state of Indiana, the United States of America. There are three main points for tonight's conversation. I will read them now to paint the border for our conversation. So the first question was the broad question about mapping the concept of urban education, and I would like to know more about why study urban education. The second question is about urban communities and leadership in education. Why research urban communities for education? Why is it important? What is urban communities? Because the theme of communities in Russian education is emerging past several years, and we are talking a lot about ecosystems, about community engagement, and I'm very interested in listening how to research this thing. And the third question for tonight is how to research the educational environment in and around urban schools. What are the points of interest? What are the maybe unusual focuses? Because I understand that some problems in educational environment that we face here in Moscow and other Russian cities sometimes might be different with the problems that you are facing in Indiana or in other states of America. So tonight we are having our guests. Okay, we're still guests for each other from IUPUI School of Education. Here is our photo. Last time we met in January 2020, right before the lockdown. And I'm very happy to introduce our tonight's speakers. It's Brendan Maxcy, Associate Dean of Research and Faculty Development at School of Education. Brendan, hello.
Hello. Sorry.
Hi. Yeah, wonderful. And Suong Nguyen, Associate Professor of Urban Education Leadership and Policy, Department.
Hi there.
And David Nguyen, Assistant Professor, tenure track in Urban Education Leadership and Policy Studies program. Hello, David.
Good evening, everyone.
Yeah, good morning to you. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us today. And as we were preparing for tonight's session, there will be like 10-15 minutes for each of you to hold the word and to talk more about your perspective. And I guess after each speech, we will have some time to answer any questions or to discuss something about what you mentioned in your speech. And and this is it for tonight. My name is Maxim. I will be the facilitator for our conversation. I will also ask some questions, and I hope we will do fine tonight. Okay, so Brandon, maybe you could take the word as a first person, as a first speaker tonight.
No, that sounds great. And Maxim, first, just many thanks for inviting us and to kind of join in this conversation with regard to education in the city and share what we're seeing, but also share with you the issues that we have in common and how those kind of contexts differ a little bit. I think what we may do is I'm going to try to begin with that first question you laid out and talk a little bit about that, and followed by David in being to kind of map out the context of the study of urban education. And then I think Tushin was going to focus a little bit around the issue of the study of urban communities. And I might circle back, or we might as a group, on that third question then on how to research the educational environment and what a common conversation across contexts may bring to that, if that makes good sense.
That makes good sense. Thank you very much. I really like this idea. So would you like to start this conversation?
That sounds good. And what I'll do, I'll give you a brief introduction. I know you put the placed slide up just on my background and my work a little bit as a preface for that, because this is an area that I've come to, but it's not necessarily one that when I was initially doing my studies or doing my graduate work, I thought intensely about urban education. But as a faculty member at the Indiana University School of Education at IUPUI, that focus on urban education, on urban communities, is one that our institution, which is a relatively young one, and as universities go here, of about 50 years old, was one that was developed, and they're kind of celebrating that kind of anniversary and have been over years, to focus on the issues of an urban university and what that can bring. And the IU School of Education has continued to focus in that area. But as I'll talk about a little bit, our focus on urban education and what that means has continued to evolve in the way that you've pointed to for the session, the terminology, what the foci are, what that means. And I think we continue to kind of grapple with that. And so this conversation is very important to us and continues to help us define and redefine who we are, who we're serving, and kind of the ends of that research. My background first was as a school teacher, sometimes in urban settings, sometimes in what we've referred to as suburban settings. But my background is from a rural community in the very northeastern corner of the U.S. And from a farm. And as I was doing my graduate studies, my focus was around educational reforms and how school leaders, school administrators were responding to those. And those reforms fall under what we talk about kind of commonly now as neoliberal reforms, a way of thinking about how to bring about improvements in education by modeling schools and school systems on markets, putting schools in competition with one another, and that is often seen as a vehicle to drive reform into systems that have been notoriously difficult to change or seem somewhat resistant to change. And my work in the early 2000s and since around that area have really looked at the way in which those have transformed education in ways that are maybe in alignment and consistent with the logic of the reform, but potentially problematic for the communities that they were intended to serve, or that maybe have been historically underserved by education and educational systems. That brought me, when we moved to IUPUI, to really focus on how those manifest for and in urban communities, as opposed to more broadly across our states or across the country. Or even I did some work in Thailand at looking at similar reforms and how those played out in that context as well. What I would say then, in talking about kind of what I now understand and increasingly understand in conversation with my colleagues here about education, has kind of evolved over time, and try to put that in a little bit of a historical context, because I think that there is often an understanding of urban educational studies and even urban studies as a relatively new, but kind of historians of education will kind of point to kind of an evolution of this over a much longer period of time. And in the US, there's probably over the past almost 2 centuries now been an ongoing but somewhat kind of cyclical focus on urban education, cities, their development, and kind of particularly in the kind of mid to latter part of the 19th century, kind of around 2 issues. And I think those shape some of the ways in which we think about urban education in the US. And I can always speak. And those are significant immigration to the US kind of in the mid 19th century, and how that shaped cities, along with kind of the simultaneous and I guess integrated issues of the industrialization of the US economy, the movement from a very rural to a much more industrial economy, and the focus of that in the cities. And that the movement of rural communities towards cities, and the immigration of those from Europe and Asia into those cities. And then what's often referred to here as the Great Migration of Southern Blacks to Midwestern and Northeastern cities to both kind of seek work, but also to kind of escape the oppressive practices of what we talked about as the Jim Crow South, a vehicle for denying rights to Blacks in the South and the civil rights. And all of those led to kind of tremendous growth and the development of space, but it also has led to an association of urban studies and urban education studies, also as a focus primarily on communities of color and their plight and problems in education in the US. And that tends to be sometimes a code when we talk about urban education in the US, is to talk about it as primarily focused on communities of color and their problems, and that diminishes or that limits some of the focus of that. And so I think there's also an ongoing effort to recognize kind of that, as you pointed out, the broader mapping of what goes into understanding urban education here. And also the way in which that focus as urban communities and urban education as a problem to be solved also limits the way in which we even understand those communities as, from what we talk about as a deficit orientation, that the Black communities have problems. Schools serving the Black community or communities of color more generally are problematic, and that we need to solve those problems. and that can shift our attention away from assets within those communities, assets within cities more generally, and a broader understanding of cities as kind of potentially rich, wealth-intensive spaces as well. And so understanding that dynamic and what cities bring to education also has to become a focus of that. That includes recognizing major wealth disparities in our cities. So I know globally and certainly in the US, increasing concern about the way in which housing and lack of housing is playing into urban dynamics and the implications of that for students and communities and displacing those within becomes an area that is integrated as we think about urban spaces. In Indianapolis, and I think in many cities within the US, that has also included the way in which desegregation and the history of attempting to desegregate schools has played into the development of our cities. And Maxim, spending time here, you recognize the kind of notion of there's Indianapolis, the Midwestern city we're in, but what are sometimes referred to as the donut or the surrounding townships that are more white, often somewhat more affluent, and the even further suburbs. So the growth and development of our educational system in Indianapolis, but in a lot of cities, also is marked by similar kind of housing dynamics, similar institutional and legal dynamics that David can speak in much more depth about, that give shape to our schools, but also give shape to how they've been resourced, under-resourced in some spaces, and more substantially resourced in others. Those also play into, and I alluded to earlier, the need to understand the broader kind of political and policy structure of these cities, but how they interplay with other institutions like educational institutions. And in Indianapolis, those are marked by and shaped by racial dynamics, but also by other power dynamics, ways of using evolving governance structures to empower some groups at the expense of others. So those have class dynamics associated with them, and I think those are always an area of focus, but can get lost as we focus on particular immediate problems on how these reflect an evolution and kind of a historical context that needs to be understood as well as the social and immediate political context and economic issues. One thing, and I will point to this, and then I may turn to David, that I think we're immediately understanding, and you mentioned it at the outset, and I think it becomes central to a conference like this or any conference going on since about mid. I'm trying to even remember which year we're in, but as COVID kind of unfolded on us, is that we're currently experiencing a tremendous crisis around how we deal with COVID as an immediate problem, but also how that is overlaid and intersecting with an ongoing challenges for those same communities. So COVID in the United States, and I'm guessing in Russia as well as around the globe, is impacting those different communities very differently. And so what we're also thinking about is the way in which a particular crisis like COVID will play out over the next decade in terms of how it has been impacting students of color, how it's been impacting communities who were more displaced economically by it and who are challenged by it. And I would say, as a way of kind of full disclosure on the panel as well, my spouse, Tushun, and I, as we've been talking about and thinking about urban communities as from a standpoint of policy studies, from the standpoint of leadership studies, think about that in kind of abstract ways and kind of think about that in ways that are trying to understand theoretically what's going on. But as our kindergartner has begun school in this space, we feel like we have also a more intimate, and I'll speak to David as well, because he also has a kindergartner starting this year as well, that these are shaping our understanding of it differently as we engage with schools as institutions and kind of the safety of our children around that, but how that's playing out for school administrators and the stresses on teachers and the stresses on communities. And that this current context is, I think, magnifying many of those same issues that we're looking at, but is also reshaping those in ways because of broader political cross currents around how people understand COVID and how we should be responding to that. And so I think that also will play into kind of the mapping of how we understand urban education for some years to come, how we've responded well or poorly to this particular moment. I think will be an area of intense focus for some time. I'm gonna pause there and turn to David, who has particular expertise both in this community and with the legal context as well.
Okay, Brendan, thank you very much for this very broad introduction covering this history and the map of the problems that are sufficient now. And as Brendan said, we welcome in David Nguyen, Assistant Professor of Urban Education, Leadership and Policy Studies Program. David, please, could you join our conversation and cover this theme from your perspective?
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Maxcy. As Brendan mentioned, Indianapolis is my hometown. I was born here 3 months after my parents resettled here after being Vietnamese refugees. So I did not grow up on a farm, and I'm not from a rural area. But that being said, I guess Indianapolis can be seen as rural and suburban compared to other cities we have in the United States. As you all can see, and then if you feel free, you can more than welcome to search me on Google Scholar, and you'll sort of see all the various scholarship that I'm engaged in. I examine issues of law and policy when we think about sort of the P20 spectrum in education, and when I think about issues that intersect with law and policy in education, many times they are laws, policies, and practices as they have implications for minoritized and marginalized communities. So when we think about issues of immigration that Brendan has mentioned, issues of race and ethnicity, language learners, English language learners, all those various things have some sort of law and policy intersections. And as a result, that's kind of where I examine and conduct my research. So as if I sort of go back to thinking first about maybe your initial sort of broad question is these ideas around urbanism or urban education, is it confusion, or is it a resource for joint research? To me, right, I think it's a resource for joint research. At least in the context of the United States, right? The issues of marginalized and minoritized students and populations do not just happen in urban areas, right? But are vastly diversifying and pushing into even suburban and rural communities. And so while there are certain connotations that come with the word urban, it is not an isolated event. And so many times when I talk about, laws and policies that may have implications for students and their families, these same issues, and I'll dive in a little bit deeper in a little bit, but these same issues even, right, have implications for our suburban and even very rural schools. Before coming back to Indiana, I was at the University of North Dakota, and if anybody is familiar with geography, it's just 1 hour south from the Canadian border, where if you look at Grand Forks, North Dakota, it can be very, not diverse, very white, very Anglo-Saxon white. But if you look closely, right, because of the agriculture sort of around that area, there are many migrant families and migrant students who are sort of seasonal migrant workers that do, come and help pick the potatoes or the other crops in the area. And whether they leave or many times because, they have spent some time there, they end up staying, right? The issues that we a lot of times talk about in urban settings also apply into those very rural settings, but it's just not visibly apparent. So to me, I think it's areas of joint research and joint awareness that we should sort of pay attention to. Now, thinking about sort of urban education and why urban education is because when we think about urban, in my perspective, when we think about laws and policies, our judicial system or our policymaking system usually likes to sort of create laws and policies that will sort of have the broadest touch, right, as much as it can, the broadest touch to as many people that it can. Now, it's not going to be able to be applicable to every single person in its community or in its society, but policymakers and judiciary usually try to, right, make these rulings or create policies that are going to have sort of the broadest impact, right? I mean, I think that's the ideal. That's sort of the goal. And so, when we think about the intentions many times of policymakers or the judiciary, the impacts of their decisions or their policymaking decisions are going to have the greatest sort of potential impact in urban areas, given that's where the vast majority of people are living. Now, the other sort of factor to think about urban environments is the fact that our urban environments are many times the most diverse environments that we have in our state or in our communities. And as a result, while the judiciary or policymakers try to make policies that have, sort of the furthest reach, right, their biases or their intentions may not sort of have the right implications for many of our marginalized and minoritized communities. And so, for example, I'll just sort of maybe provide a couple of examples here, and then we can sort of have a discussion around it. But when we think about sort of the diversity that we have in the United States, right? And if we think about, for example, what Brenton mentioned, the historical context of the United States, right? We come from a colonial perspective that has enslaved particularly Black African Americans, but then also has created laws and policies segregating people of color in the United States. And that being said, right, we have a policy, what we call sort of, thinking about affirmative action, that was implemented sort of in the early 1960s as a way to sort of, promote and think about more inclusion of minoritized or marginalized peoples, but in particular people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds into not only the workforce and employment and education. And while we have had this policy since the 1960s, there has been constant and even current sort of pushback against these policies because it goes against, it pushes against sort of the dominant narrative that supports the dominant sort of particularly white Anglo-Saxon population. And so thinking about sort of how we map out and think about sort of urban education, right? We have to not only think about sort of the political interests that are in play with our various communities, and how those political interests or the power and conflict happens within our communities, that then leads into the creation of policies that then pushes into the creation of laws that even sort of solidify those various policies and practices that we sort of have within our urban communities. So, I guess when I sort of think about, how we sort of think about mapping it out, in my perspective, right, it's looking at sort of where the various power dynamics and various interests are in our communities, being able to empower communities in order to have their voice be heard and be part of that policy-making process, and right, the legislative and the judiciary law legal making process as well. Now, I haven't been even keeping track of time.
Thank you, David. I guess we might make a little pause here and ask Anastasia whether we have any questions or anything in the chat, or I might ask some questions for Brandon and David, because I think this is the first part of the conversation, and then we will continue.
Oh, no, we don't have any questions from YouTube, but I would suggest Maxim to sometimes turn off the presentation so that viewers on YouTube can see our speakers.
Okay. If we also have the host here, so кто нас поддерживает технически, я могу вас попросить просто ставить spotlight на спикера. Да, то есть в центр внимания.
Those that support us technically, please put spotlight in front of the speaker so that it would be easier to see. But I'll be doing that as well. Okay.
Anastasia and David, I would like to. I really have the couple of questions to you, and also I see the raised hand from Catherine. So I will hold my questions, and Catherine, I would like to hear from you. So if you will speak Russian,
думаю,
English.
Так как у меня скорее замечание, но уточнение, лучше сказать вопрос.
Okay. So Catherine says she has a comment. So please join us. And
I have a little point of criticism.
David, to Suong, you might switch to interpretation, and let's try how it works. Okay, so Catherine, we are here for you.
Well, if I understand correctly, because I'm listening to simultaneous translation, all your research is connected either with acute social questions or political questions. So your task is to orient the educational process, to problematize it, not just to be solving these questions towards social issues and political issues. Social rights, which is very interesting because it completely does not coincide with how we understand urbanicity here, because here we're mostly connected with the city itself as a phenomenon. You actually moved to a very interesting, you made a very interesting point about your origin and your farming background, but these problems, social and political problems, they are equal in both places. They are equal. They are similar in a way, both for the city and for the countryside. So, is there any question there, or is it just your comment? This was just a comment, okay? maybe if there's any point that you understood out of it, maybe you can specify something. So Brendan, David, if
about what you're saying.
Yeah, I would comment. I would agree with, I think, the premise of the comment. I think that's consistent with some of the issues that we see and need to be understood within the context of studying urban education, but also urban studies more generally. That, as you point to, a number of these social and political issues are not distinctive of urban spaces, but may be characterized as such as the problematic space relative to urban and, suburban and rural spaces. And in focusing them on it this way, it decontextualizes them in a way that's not helpful. And it also disconnects them because, as I was suggesting earlier, our suburban communities are intimately tied in policy, in law, in social context to our urban spaces, and in many ways have developed around that. And so to focus on the urban to the exclusion of those other communities fails to properly kind of capture the way in which urban dynamics relate to it. I think David is pointing to that as well, the way in which law and policy evolves. So I agree with the premise and think that needs to be part of the agenda for how we understand that here in the US and more broadly. I think we often also, as I gather from your question, don't always contextualize the development of urban education within the city and how it plays into that in ways that, again, focus us in too narrowly on solely issues of communities of color, and again, draw the focus around the way in which their presence in cities is part of our broader context in the US and a broader history, and that we need to both understand that, and to understand that also helps us understand how that's playing out currently in our schools and our leadership around that, but also how we might broaden the focus and better understand the dynamic for those communities. Because I do think that can become, as I said, a code for what urban means here. Urban only means the focus on communities of color and not those broader structures and not those broader dynamics that need to be understood within that as well. Hopefully that captures it. And David may also.
I think that definitely captures it, Brendan. I guess the only thing that I would add to that is at least the way that the laws work in the United States is we have federal laws, state laws, and then local laws. So as the participant, I guess, maybe it was a question or observation that while education in the city, or while urbanism, right, while there might be sort of local laws and policies that will differ based on the context, or not even the laws and policies, but even the practices and the implications from those laws and policies and the practices will differ, based on either a suburban or a rural or an urban context. We sort of have built-in mechanisms where if we think of federal law as sort of being broadly based, state and then local laws can then sort of narrow in and focus a little bit more from that baseline of federal law, so that way their laws and policies, can differ within their local context. But From my perspective, though, is that because, right, there is sort of that differentiation of state and local policy making and practices, that many times the implementation, their way of implementing laws and policies are going to differ based on their own biases and understanding of, right, the issues compared to the urban context, where the urban context, maybe in a rural or suburban, where the urban context can potentially help inform, and vice versa, right, the various different contexts. It's just that, in my perspective, I don't like to think them as sort of silos. They're not sort of exclusive, because, there's at least the way I sort of view it, there's really no boundary, right, between what is urban and what is suburban or what is rural, really. We have boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries, but, the sort of thinking about, what is, to me, what is urban and what is suburban and rural, there's sort of that gray area. So the implications can translate to learn in various different contexts.
Okay, thank you for your comments. We have a question from Gennady Bulanov. Gennady, would you like to tell your question? Вы хотите с голосом сказать, да?
Maybe you'd like to voice your question yourself.
Yes,
I can voice my questions. Yes, thank you for this first part. I have a question, perhaps more of a discussion on what was said by the colleagues earlier. As I've heard it from, and it's also my personal position, content-wise, that the peculiarities of urban education is it has to do with the volume and intensity of the variety. So there's a volume of variety of all of the sort of educational services, subjects, consumers, conditions, infrastructure, and so forth and so on. And on the other hand, it's not only the volume of variety, but it's the speed of renewal of this variety. To me, that's an essential trait of urban lifestyle and education. So based on that notion, I think, on that grounds, I have a question. It's a question to you and to me, really. It's a question, just something to ponder on, so to say. So there is this, we're facing the task at Teresa, how to properly sharpen a pencil. The sharper I make the pencil, the better. It just writes better. But on the other hand, it breaks faster. So here's the task: how do you sharpen the pencil properly? And the pencil is worth $1 million, or it's priceless because like human life. So from that standpoint, if you follow this logic, the more we pump and cultivate variety, the better. Because there are a lot of different consumers, there's competitive environment and education and so forth and so on. But on the other hand, where does it break faster? At the point of decision making, because educational policy in the end has to do with decision making regarding the norms and so forth and so on. The benchmarks and so forth. And my question, this is the essence of my question: how do we find this golden mean? How do we get rid of this contradiction? While maintaining the variety. We're keeping this urban trait, and on the other hand, how do we make decisions with the use of urban communities? Because it's not the by majority principle. Because if we talk about innovations, it's normally the minority that is right. So that's the pass I'd like to make on our common playing field. That's an interesting question because we're talking from various cultural traditions and various organizational traditions, and that's why.
If you got the question, would like to hear your answer, or just your opinion.
I'll chime in, but welcome others because I think it's a really nice way of pointing to, and also kind of that third question around how does sharing across cultural contexts may point to different ways of kind of understanding. And I think this relates to the first point made as well. One way we talk about this so part of our work is preparing future educators, and particularly for David, Tushun, and I, educational leaders, those who are going to be in administrative roles. And one way of understanding some of those tensions, and I think those are tensions of effectiveness of the organizational, the mechanism, how well we provide education, the way in which we prepare students for work, prepare students to live as citizens, and kind of the effectiveness of it is often contrasted here with other potential values we might pursue. Equity, how well do we serve all students? Are there some that are benefiting more than others? But also efficiency, how many resources do we wish to put into this enterprise versus other things that we might invest in? And the fourth one that we often talk about in ours is also the issue of choice. How much do the individual, and that's probably in various points in our context, and I think right now or over the past 20 years has been very prominent. How do individuals, persons, but also families make choices to serve their own ends? And how much sway do they have? And so one way we often talk about those as being intention, and that our reforms often reflect one of those prioritized at the expense of others. And how do we resolve those? And I think currently our focus, certainly in the School of Education, has been on the issue of equity and inequity, and how have reforms served some and not served others, but putting that into a broader question of what other values might be being pursued. In what ways do neoliberal reforms see a sharpening of the pencil, see making the urban educational system function better to yield more education, right, as a commodity or as a product? And what are the costs of that in terms of equity? Helps us kind of think through. These are choices that we're making politically, making as matters of policy, and they have different implications for different communities. And I think it's easy to focus on one set of values as the primary set of values and the others as things that should be devalued. And I think looking across these contexts, but also over time, helps us think through that there are legitimate differences of opinion on what might be prioritized and what might not, and how that might work better and worse for different communities. And I think that relates to a question that was in the chat also, is how those are balanced over time. And I think certainly a strong focus of this School of Education is historically, how have some communities benefited more than others from those? And that plays into an anti-racist focus for us, an equity focus for us that distinguishes our pursuit of that and how we understand the urban and urban education that is different from others who seek and pursue those different reforms, not necessarily as right or wrong, right? Certainly we bring those values to it, but as an understanding that context. So I appreciate kind of that notion of setting those values in tension and what other values are also in tension with those. I'll pause there. I'm not sure if that, I appreciate that point.
Yeah, so this is both the comment and the spoken question are from the one person. So thank you, Gennady, for your question. Am I understand correctly that you are in Krasnoyarsk right now? Геннадий, вы в Красноярске сейчас?
Нет, я сейчас не в Красноярске.
Но вы ведете основную
Сейчас нет, я
деятельность
сейчас
там?
But you're
Отлично, поздравляю, отлично.
I'm in Gelendzhik right now, but actually, your professional activity actually takes place in Krasnoyarsk. At the moment, I moved to Moscow, but Krasnoyarsk is still, I still work with Krasnoyarsk. That's great. That's just a comment also, just so we understand the geography. So we have different opinions from different geography. Yes, that's great. Thank you so much. Brandon, David.
Anastasia is translating the questions or replica or some phrases in the chat. Thank you, Anastasia, for doing this for us. So you might just have a look there also, yeah, because we have some kind of conversation also there. And now I guess it's time to continue our bigger conversation. And before we listen to Suong, I'd like to ask another question and talk about teachers and educators. Because when we are talking about policy makers, when we are talking about urban communities and problems that they face, trying to get to the education. But Brandon, you and your school, you are working with teachers. You do teacher education, so you prepare urban educators, and those are not only teachers but also community leaders, principals, and etc., etc. Why is it important to pose these questions and to do this research and then to teach educators about this kind of problems, about politics, economics, urban communities? How does this knowledge and skills affect the quality of teaching of future teachers?
What I would say, and I think, and what Tushuna say may also offer insight into this. And I noticed in some of the comments, and because I think these are somewhat context specific because of our particular history around race and the dynamics of that, as well as class. But one thing that's tended to be true, I didn't say this, but it's, I guess, personal biography is always part of the why we're focused on what we're focused on. I am the son of educators. I'm a grandson of educators, and it's not uncommon for educators, I guess, to beget more educators. Whether that's a family business or not, I don't know. But one thing that has tended to be true in the U.S. is our teacher corps is quite different in terms of their background, their demographics, than oftentimes the students they serve, particularly in urban settings. And so our corps of teachers tend to be whiter, more female, and more often from rural suburban areas, not always, and find their way in schools and have different experiences in schools and schooling. So I was socialized, right, as an educator in a particular context that I then bring to as I kind of move to urban settings. I become kind of, that's part of the common story for the US, right? Is often people are moving from, and this is probably true also, Russia, tend to be moving from more rural areas toward more urban areas, but we can bring a particular perspective. But that's also true on how we've experienced school. People who come to be educators often had good experiences in school and understand schooling in certain ways, and can be a little bit, I can have blind spots toward how others have experienced school, toward what other ways of thinking about education and our educational experience can enrich how we reach out. So in our work here with the refugee community, one of our counterparts said to us that schools are not designed to serve the diverse populations that we're told to celebrate. And so we have urban communities that are, as the previous commenter, are diverse, are rich, but they're often served by educators who are less diverse as a group than they are, and therefore can fail to appreciate the linguistic and cultural assets that others bring to the space, fail to appreciate, as David was mentioning earlier, how a different trajectory into schools means you've experienced life in a different way. And so I think part of the mission of this school is to help understand what that diversity brings to the school, to the community, and otherwise, and also how diminishing that or overlooking that can lead to a deficit orientation toward those communities, towards seeing them as lacking the dominant language or lacking a particular understanding. And so I think that's one of our challenges in preparing educators to work in diverse settings. And I can honestly say that was not part of my education. So I've gotten that as an educator, as trying to and understanding my own blind spots in that, because I understand how that position me or failed to position me maybe.
Yeah, so I now understand that this is in our public conversation here in like Moscow, okay, we also have these questions about how to work with the migrant population, how to work with marginalized population, etc. But sometimes I got a feeling, this is like my personal feeling, that these two questions about education are parallel lines in pedagogical, pedagogical education here in Russia. Because on one hand, we have the first line is about subjects, about methodology, how to teach, what are the educational results, personal results in education, etc. And on the other hand, we have the conversation about education as a social practice, about raising like a community participants, a community of citizens even. So unfortunately, sometimes when it comes to the classroom, those two themes are parallel things. They don't cross in the teacher's head here, usually. So we face the problems, we see them, we experience them, but when we teach educators, these lines are not crossed. I'm just like thinking, maybe I'm not right. Maybe I'm just like living in my bubble, my informational bubble. So, okay, we have 30 minutes left. And to Suong, I really would like to hear from you, from your perspective about your experience and your research about urban educators, because I'm experiencing some lack of, I guess, like real examples. Yeah, and I know that you are doing this kind of research about migrants, etc. Or maybe you would like to cover some other questions too in your prepared speech.
No, I appreciate that, Maxim. And I too want to thank you and everybody here for joining the conversation. It's been a lot of fun to listen and to engage this conversation. I think is important in our own context, but cross-nationally as well. So I'm going to do like Brendan a little bit, and that is, I do think that where we come from, our personal biographies inform what we do, how we perceive and interact with our world. So, and I hope this connects to this conversation. So I'm the daughter of refugees from Vietnam. My parents came to this country as a result of war. They were dislocated multiple times, and I know that there are 70 million people who are experiencing dislocation at this moment, or more actually now probably. And that's meant particular things for the way I've experienced the world here and the way I interact with it and think about it. So my parents as refugees came to this country without social, linguistic, monetary resources to help them ease their way into this space. We ended up in San Antonio, Texas, which is a more urban space. And that often happens for refugees in the United States who are resettled. They're often resettled into more urban spaces where there are, more services, more access to different social services, schools, hospitals, things of this nature. That the experience of being the daughter of refugees, growing up, going through schools, public schools, large public urban schools, it very clearly, I experienced, I think, very clearly, particularly when I was in high school and college, when my consciousness was a little bit had moved beyond myself, right? An understanding of how others who looked like me, sounded like my parents, came from the neighborhoods that they were living in, how they were treated, how they were understood by our school organizations, by our school bureaucracies, by our school policies, right? I think, as Brendan mentioned earlier, in the US context, the word urban carries pretty specific meaning. It's used as coded language, right? So when folks use oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes when folks use the language of urban, it's pejorative. It's meant to signal the Black, the brown, the poor, in sort of nice speak, so that we don't have to reveal ourselves as racist or whatever. But in those spaces, that's the lived experience of that was kids who looked like me being put in portable buildings in their schools, not interacting with the kids in the main brick and mortar buildings, right? Being tracked into particular kinds of curriculum that really limited opportunity and life chances for them. And this has occurred for a long, long time. It wasn't just, it's not new, and it continues. One of the things that I think has been important for me as I think about urban is an understanding that urban is seen that way. As I think when we talk about education, in education circles in the US, that understanding is pretty prominent, that understanding of the coded language of urban. But when we think about urban studies, the urban studies folks have often, I think it's evolved, but we often think of urban just in terms of population density, lots of folks in the same spaces in a bounded space. And we, as in education leadership, we've drawn a lot from management, right? The business world and management. And I think, since folks have come together, congregated in larger numbers, we've always had a desire to manage others, sometimes ourselves, but folks in our business, in terms of educational leadership, have a tendency to want to manage others, put in place policies, practices that can shunt and channel folks in the directions that we want to shunt and channel them to produce the things that we want, right? Educated beings who will go out and be productive economic beings in the world. I think it's important, the pairing of urban and communities, I really like, because also in our context in the US, when we've talked about schools, we've often used different kinds of metaphors to think about schools and how to manage them, right? Schools as machines. If we get the right gears, parts in place in the right order, then everything will flow smoothly and go in the directions that we want. Or if we understand schools as a biological organism, right, then we have to understand their their habitat, their environment, how they interact with the world. And if we can understand that better, then we can order and manage that in a particular direction. There is a scholar, Thomas Giovanni, who talked about, he contested these particular ideas about how do we look at schools as organizations in order to manage people. And he instead said, what if we thought about schools as communities instead of things to be managed? Because we all exist in communities, different communities, and we understand that communities can't be managed in that way, right? Communities are relational. Communities are spontaneous. It can't be predicted always, right? Certainly there are some predictable aspects about community, right? We want to make sure that we're getting along. We don't enjoy violence and conflict, I don't think. And so how do we relate with one another in order to advance in whatever direction it is that we want to advance? And so the idea of thinking about urban and communities, urban in a way that isn't just about population density, but understanding urban, that density as productive of many, many, many different kinds of relationships, right? So what does that density produce? What does that density make possible or impossible in terms of those kinds of relationships? I think when we think about diversity, I think about diversity of leadership. From where does leadership emerge, right? So some of the work that I did in schools is around looking at a Vietnamese language and culture program that was serving a larger number of Vietnamese immigrants and refugees. And in that space, the experience of what it meant to be coded urban was the experience of being viewed as a space of desperation, of degradation, of lack, in need of help, right? In need of others' help. I'm not only interested in educational leadership and policy, but one of the things that I do is I do qualitative research. And my work with that community was an ethnographic work, very specific to the local space and the local time. And what I saw in that space was leadership emerging from these individuals who were viewed as less than, as viewed as not having the capacity, the assets, the resources necessary in order to lead, not from that sort of conventional perspective. And so I think when we think about the need for urban education leadership and looking specifically into those local spaces and contexts, the variety, the diversity, the specific look into those, there's a political philosopher, Iris Young, who talks about justice, and she says that justice in the universal doesn't get us anywhere. We like to have abstract conversations about what justice is and what justice looks like and how we can be more just, more fair, more equitable. But what she says is that it's only in the local, it's only in the specifics that we can actually perceive, envision, and enact justice, right? And so to me, the hopefulness of urban spaces is that there is such variety. There is a multitude of possibilities, right? A ferment of possibilities for different ways of thinking, different ways of acting, different ways of engaging politically. So I think for me, again, those questions around urban density, what relationships can be produced there, what's possible, what's made impossible by those spaces, how can we rethink those things? And then also thinking more locally and specifically as we look in those spaces, what is that veritable ferment of possibility there for the ways in which leadership can emerge, what it looks like, and raise into question, into view for ourselves, what are our expectations of those things? How have we limited ourselves in ways that I think urban spaces spaces of intense diversity, intense politics, intense social relations, how those things can reveal for us what we've taken for granted, and in doing so limited the possibilities for doing things differently, more equitably. I'm going to stop there.
Suong, thank you so much, because this perspective makes the whole conversation make more volume, you know, and your speech reminded me what I've heard from Professor Franklin Tuitt from University of Connecticut. He is a chief diversity officer, and he once said that sometimes, but not sometimes, like every time, the question and the problem is of diversity and equity is the question that we should pose in the classroom, and everything starts like in the classroom. Yeah. So on one hand, on one point, we have politics, economics, we have this big machine, then we have the machine of management, of school management, regional management, etc. But the class management and the figure of teacher, this is the point of the contact with the children, with their families, with the local community, and thank you very much for covering this part of the problem. And we have a hand raised by Gennady. Also, we have some comments in chat, so please take some time to check the chat. And Gennady, ваш комментарий, пожалуйста, да.
Можно, да?
Да.
Gennady, your comment, please. Yes, I'll be short. I'll be brief. I don't want to be abusing time. Well, that's what we are here for. All right. Thank you for this talk. I know everyone here. I'm on terms with everyone here. All right. So maybe I will speak, but just be brief. Okay, you can speak however harsh, but brief. Let's say I've already finished. I'm really afraid of the absolutization of leadership. That's the first thesis, because if there are leaders, there are non-leaders as well. The leadership of some is non-leadership of others, if you understand. So this is inequality by definition. How can we democratize education if we put stakes on leaders? I will suggest another idea, and perhaps we can think about research in this area. This other idea is that local communities allocate they create certain paragons of the norm, certain standards. And then after that, leadership, yes to the leadership, but everyone is moving towards these norms by themselves, if you understand what I'm trying to tell you, to these standards by themselves. No, wait a minute. I think that there was something else here when we talk about leadership. I understand that it's a different sort of leadership. No, wait a minute. I will try to interpret it my way, all right? And the colleagues, if maybe will confirm or refute that. I also write myself down to the leaders of education, and referring to Brendan's words, I also see my task to close the blind spots, to cover blind spots of the teachers' blind spots. So my research activity now is connected to the fact that that the teacher is my contemporary. He came my equal. He came from another background situation. His reality, the reality of his background and his childhood is one. Our current realities are different. The landscape has changed, and the characteristics that differentiate, that differ us, has also changed. And my position, my leading position here is to identify that and make it less stressful for all participants of the educational interaction. So leader as an observer, as a mediator, perhaps yes, but it's not my priority to define just how it must be. It's my priority to see how it is and perhaps create a different focus. Gennady, thank you for your help. Wait a minute, but I want to say those are three different models. It's leadership as rivalry, leadership as the coding of the situation, and leadership to myself. So, да, мы.
So there is no like a specific address. So the question is for all our panelists tonight. So maybe to Suong, you would like to answer this passage. What is your point of view on leadership? What is leadership in your context of your research of your school?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we, in our principalship preparation program, there are certainly folks who see themselves as leaders and come to us because they think that they can be nodes of influence, right, in schools, and they certainly are, right. I think for our program faculty see leadership as a much broader phenomenon. And want for our students to think about leadership differently. And I think you're right. Leadership isn't leadership to one isn't necessarily leadership to another, right? And that to me is also part of your earlier question. If I understood the interpretation of the question around how do we get rid of these contradictions to help our organizations function. To me, I don't know that we want to get rid of the contradictions, right? To me, the contradictions can be extraordinarily productive. So leadership to one, right, and not leadership to another can be very productive of leadership within the group, right? In helping to advance, well, how does the we in this instance negotiate that, move forward together? I think that if there were no contradictions, I think we would have very little space to be productive as collectives, as organizations, right? And so for us, I think leadership is.
Это противоречие, если мы понимаем и удерживаем.
Геннадий, не перебивайте, пожалуйста, подождите. Yeah, Suong, sorry.
Gennady, please don't interrupt. We apologize for inconvenience. Please continue.
No, it's not at all. So I think for us, we want our students to understand leadership as more complex, more expansive, that leadership isn't necessarily about quashing conflict, right, or contradictions, but it is beyond certain formal roles, and that it must be beyond the formal role, otherwise we don't get anything done. I don't know. I'll ask my colleagues to chime in as well.
Yeah, so this makes also sense because this point of view on leadership brings us to some thoughts about how to manage educational systems, what are the new forms of this dialogue, and how not to become very how to not to be under one person who makes decisions. Yeah, and this is the point of like a democratic dialogue. Yeah, how to facilitate this conversation, and that's okay to have different points of view, and this is the clue of this conversation. Yeah, how to find this way to understand each other and to come to the conclusion. Brendan, please.
Yeah, because I think this is a really interesting point. And actually, Suong and I have written about it and would agree completely with the point that the prior speaker had made, that when you define someone as the leader, then others become the followers, and that can become a very limiting and problematic way of thinking about leadership. Peter Grahn and some of the work that we had kind of drawn on around notions of distributed leadership raises the notion of not a leader, but a negotiation among leaders. All hold potential for leadership and contribute to that. But I think that connects to that. The other point that was made that I really like very much is the notion of study and research around local communities and generating as well as reproducing values. Because one thing that, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the air quotes, which we use here a lot, which means when I say leadership, it's not exactly what I mean. It's what other people call it. But our field has appropriated this term leadership because it's somehow sexy. It sounds better than manager or administrator. But it also comes with this notion of imbuing future leaders with particular values. And so, as I said earlier, the value right now on equity, if we can imbue teachers and future administrators with an emphasis on equity, they will be better. But it takes values as something that are somewhat static and held, not something that are generated and created and recreated. And that one of the things that I think the other speaker had mentioned as well is understanding. It's taken me a while to understand that my experience coming from a rural setting was also that's not deficient on my part. It's not that I certainly did not have as much experience with diversity, but I bring a particular perspective. How do we, in negotiating what schools will look like, both value that experience and value experience from urban or suburban settings, or from a Vietnamese background or a Black background, and I think that those are generative of values in the way that was spoken of. And it's not simply a competition. Values sometimes are thought of as something that are simply allocated, but I think they're also something that are created. And as Suong pointed out, I think they can be created in common, in conversation, and through conflict, as much as resolving the conflicts. And so we also kind of trouble the notion that we can resolve conflicts and bring about some kind of universal, but rather we generate through those. So I really appreciated that. And I definitely appreciate the notion that to define someone as leader is to devalue the leadership of others, and also empower someone to be. Our former president, George Bush, liked to refer to him sometimes as the decider. And I think that's different than being a leader.
Yeah, and I really like this point that leadership, the leader sounds more sexy than manager, because this is the point that you started our conversation tonight, because you've been talking about like, Suong was mentioning this, as I remember, like the community is about relationships. And if you are a leader, you do manage the relationships, and if people don't like follow you, you are not the leader, so you don't have those relationships with the community, with people who live in this area. And sometimes manager doesn't have those relationships. So these are some of my like thoughts after this. We have 6 or like 5 minutes left. So Anastasia, do we have any comments from YouTube maybe?
No, we don't. We have only viewers there.
Okay, wonderful. Say hi to our viewers. So if you have any questions, we have 5 minutes left. So and we're gonna follow to this conversation to the final. And as I remember, Brandon, you had an idea to close the circle of the conversation, covering some I don't know, like conclusions or some maybe bigger questions for our conversation.
I'll do that briefly, maybe around that.
I hope you will come back to us shortly, because something goes wrong. Internet is always does something. Коллеги, да, Брэндон завис у вас тоже?
Да, я тоже не вижу.
Okay.
Brandon is currently not there, right?
Getting unfrozen, or how we say it. Let me ask David or Suong. David also is somewhere, so maybe our colleagues from Moscow city. Okay, what is happening? Where everybody's going? Okay, so maybe Catherine or Suong, you would like to say some conclusions by the end of our conversation tonight, while we're waiting for Brandon to come back and close the circle.
Ура, мне кажется, он практически уже...
Окей, Екатерина, да, Екатерина, может быть, все-таки от вас.
Екатерина, perhaps a couple of words from you. What you heard and well, I tried to mark the time as we've been moving about. But we're trying to register the point that we're trying to understand for ourselves certain kind of energy of new understanding, which the Moscow City University is part of, the educational urbanistics, which is a sort of different idea for our American colleagues. As I understand it, we are part of the kind of defining the focus here, and I would like to thank our colleagues for their example of how they themselves try to clear this understanding for themselves, how they try to counterpose their juxtapose their experience with the others' experience, and this is one of the most constructive methods. So, what else was important in this thesis about cleaning up the blind spots of today's reality for education, for autumn, as the city influences this federal legislation and the state, the city legislation, just how it's influencing here our life, and how our life is influencing it. For Moscow, it's extremely important. Moscow is a small state within a big state, and this is, so far as terra incognita for us, we so far is we're kind of afraid to go there. There's some topics that we see them, but we better not mention. Yeah. We are working with very local communities. This is understandable, but today it became kind of became very visible just without taking into account the global context of the country, of the political processes. Well, I'm afraid that this is not totally effective. All right. And these three talks that we had today, that when we understood that there's someone that talks globally, and there's, for example, Suong who analyzes local issues, and when at the point of crossing somewhere is where the changes are happening. As I understand, this is where you can become a leader in education, right? When you look at it comprehensively, sort of. Well, this is how I will probably draw the line here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Suong.
I just want to apologize for my colleagues. They're communicating here with me, and they are actually located. They are physically at the university right now, which apparently is having internet connectivity issues.
Yeah.
So they've been dropped. So it's not on your side.
I assumed that. So.
But I did want to just very quickly thank you and thank everybody for hosting us today. Was it Anastasia who was summarizing for us? I think we would all agree with you here that the macro micro relationships are things that we are thinking about all the time in terms of global and those multiple levels of decision making, policy making, and all those other pieces. For me in particular, I come from the places that I do because I've seen how the large oppressive forces can press down on folks in who are positioned in ways that are very difficult and trying. And so my work really is around thinking through how can those in those positions press back. But definitely this conversation and continuing conversations with you around that, I think we look forward to.
Yeah, so David is using like mobile internet, so thank you for coming back. I'm so sorry that something went wrong. We are almost out of time, so we are doing some conclusions. So we heard the thank you conclusion speech from Ekaterina Sonova from our Laboratory of Social Educational Practices in our university. We also heard the final words for this conversation from Suong. David, maybe you would like to add something at the end of the conversation? If you have anything to add at the finale.
Maxime, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for having us join the conversation, and look forward to hopefully at one point be able to do it in person.
Yeah. Thank you so much, my dear colleagues from both countries. Those who joined us from Russia, Gennady, thank you for your question and your thoughts and your comments. Ekaterina, thank you for your comments too. And special thanks for our entrepreneur. I'm sorry, I don't know your name because you are just like entrepreneur number 1 and number 2. But thank you so much for helping us to understand each other and to make this conversation happen. And I also see our colleagues saying thanks. Thanks from Ksenia. Да, Ксения, спасибо вам тоже большое. And summarizing what we were talking about tonight, we were talking about the power of this big conversation about educational urban studies. We're still in search of right words, how to speak, how to name this group of studies, because in Russian language we call it educational urbanistics. But if we read some researchers from Europe, we can find educational urbanism, and talking about how educational practice are important, how they can be used as a development drivers for urban formation. We also, but tonight we were talking with our colleagues from University in Indianapolis, School of Education, University IUPUI, who are doing their researches in urban education and leadership programs. So we were trying to dance around these 3 questions, and I hope that we found some bright ideas and answers about why study urban education, why research urban communities for education, and how to research. The question how is endless. And I'm hoping that we will have opportunity to continue our conversation and do our like joint research, as I mentioned before. So thank you very much for our dear speakers. Tonight we had Brandon Maxcy, PhD, Associate Dean of Research and Faculty Development in School of Education of IUPUI. Suong Nguyen, Associate Professor of Urban Education, Leadership and Policy, and Department Chair for Urban Education Counseling, Leadership and Policy Studies. Thank you so much, Suong, for joining us tonight. And David Nguyen, also Assistant Professor of Urban Education, Leadership and Policy Studies Program from School of Education at IUPUI. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And this is the final of the first day of our symposium. If you have any questions, any feedback, if you would like to share any information, please feel free to find our contacts, or you can contact me as a host of this conversation, or you can find information about our laboratory. We are starting a new master's program for teachers about how to do research in urban environment too. And let's continue our conversation sometime too. Okay. Thank you very much
to Maksim Bulanov, the host of today's talk. Thank you very much for organizing it and inviting our guests. And I'm sure that this is the beginning of something.
Yeah. This is the continuation and the new energy for our cross-country dialogue too. So we will continue our conversation tomorrow. Maybe we can do some short announcement about our tomorrow conversation with our colleagues from Krasnoyarsk.
Yes, tomorrow we'll have a talk or very continuing today's talk. We will talk about what are urban studies, how we interpret them in our everyday practices and our work with teachers and school children and students of universities. There will be a panel discussion with 4 speakers. That will be Maksim Bulanov, who is the host today, 2 of our colleagues from Krasnoyarsk, who will tell us about their projects in the city environment. I will talk about what our lab does in this trend, and the moderator, Ekaterina Sonova, will ask us a lot of difficult questions and promote discussion, and hopefully also Konstantin Bulish will join us as the opponent, and with also his questions from the point of view of their urban research of urbanism and the cities.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone. We'll have also there will be streaming on YouTube, and there will be possibility to ask questions.
So I will share all the links for you, David, Brandon, to Suong. As I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the conversation, this will be in Moscow afternoon because Krasnoyarsk is pretty also far away as Indianapolis from us. So it's going to be like a late night where you are, but you will have opportunity to see the recording. And please, you're welcome to join other conversations in our panels. So thank you, Brandon, Suong, David. I'm so sorry that we had some troubles with the signal, but I'm so happy that they happened only like final 5 minutes of the conversation. So I wish you the best of luck and happy new educational year, and see you again in our conversations. Thank you very much.